No one noticed as she veered left, down the path toward the old gardener's shed. It was an innocuous place, just a lean-to with flaking paint and a smell of compost and linseed oil. But something had been bothering her ever since Lady Alice's mention of Edmund's writing. If he truly had come to Ivywell to finish a manuscript or even draft, one would have needed quiet, privacy. The east wing had a view, but it was not secluded. The shed, on the other hand, was both. The door creaked open under her hand, and sunlight filtered in through a cracked window. Tools lined the walls, orderly and worn. A bench, smudged with ink and flecks of dried paint, stood beneath the window. There were no pages left. No tidy sheaf of notes. But in the corner of the bench lay a broken pencil and an envelope, yellowed slightly as if from time in a pocket. Miss Marple turned it over. No name, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the top edge clearly torn from the missing piece to the letter she had found tucked in the glove. The handwriting was the same, bold and angular, written in blue-black ink. You think you have the upper hand, but I know what you did in Dover. Keep pressing me, and you'll regret it, Dover. That was the clue, not in the words necessarily, but in the specificity. Something had happened there. Something Edmund had held over someone's head, and now he was dead. She tucked the envelope into her bag just as a voice startled her from behind, Miss Marple. She turned to find Mr. Pettigrew approaching, his brow furrowed. Ah, Mr. Pettigrew. Come to study weeds for poetic inspiration. He gave a strained smile. Actually, I was looking for my fountain pen. I thought I might have dropped it here after helping with the garden display. Miss Marple gave him a careful look. I don't. Suppose you write in blue-black ink? He blinked. Why, yes, quite an observant question. Only curious, she said lightly. I always associate writers with particular inks, like perfume, don't you think? Very revealing. He seemed oddly discomfited and muttered something about checking the greenhouse before retreating. When Miss Marple returned to Church Lane, she found Elsie Denning already waiting for her, sitting with her knees drawn together and her gloved hands folded tightly over her handbag. I don't know why I came, Elsie said, before Miss Marple could speak, perhaps to confess, but I haven't done anything wrong. Not doing something wrong and not telling the truth are not always the same thing, my dear. Miss Marple said gently. Often people lie not to deceive others, but to protect themselves. Elsie's eyes brimmed. He threatened me. Edmund, he found a letter I'd written to someone in London, someone who's not my fiancé. It was foolish, naive, but he said if I didn't help him get what he wanted from Lady Alice, he'd expose me. And what did he want? He believed he had a claim to part of Ivywell, something about an old will. He wanted to force Lady Alice to sell part of the land. He said there were buyers, developers. I think she refused, of course, so he tried to use me as leverage. And the night before the fete, I told him I wouldn't help, that I'd tell Lady Alice the truth. He laughed, said no one would believe me over him. I walked away, and the next day he was dead. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and the glove, Elsie stared at her. What glove? No matter, Miss Marple said, though now she was certain the glove had not been hers, but Elsie had known the letter existed, or feared someone might find it. As the light faded over St. Mary Mead, and the village windows glowed like scattered stars, Miss Marple made one final note in her ledger. Dover, blue ink, limp, there was a pattern forming. And like the finest lace, it was delicate but deadly in its precision. The following day dawned humid and close, a pale heat pressing down on the hedgerows and curling the edges of the morning paper before the kettle had even whistled. Over in Ivywell Court, the garden had lost its fete day shine. The grass was beginning to yellow where so many feet had trampled it, and the bunting still clung limply to its poles, forgotten in the wake of far more sinister distractions. Inspector Cray was growing restless. He stood in the drawing-room, before a tall window, arms folded, eyes fixed on the gravel path where the gardener pushed a wheelbarrow with glacial indifference. "We're going in circles," Cray muttered. Constable Sims cleared his throat. "Sir, I said we're going in circles," Cray repeated, turning abruptly. "Everyone has a story. And all of them conveniently end just short of useful. And now Miss Marple's sniffing about like some village bloodhound dressed as your favourite aunt." Sims looked sheepish. "She did mention a few things yesterday, about a letter, a broken pencil, a glove." Cray narrowed his eyes. "And you didn't think to mention this? I thought she was just being Miss Marple." Cray pinched the bridge of his nose. "Get her in here." Meanwhile, Miss Marple was already 2 steps ahead. She had spent the morning in the company of Mr. Leonard Pettigrew, who had graciously offered to show her his garden narrow plot brimming with dahlias, marigolds, and an unusually large collection of mint. She watched him snip herbs with a pair of silver shears. "Writing anything these days, Mr. Pettigrew?" He smiled, but it was tight. "Not lately. My muse seems to have abandoned me since all this excitement began. That's a shame. I've always thought writing was like gardening. You must plant carefully, tend often, and be prepared for the unexpected sprout." He laughed faintly, trimming a stem with unnecessary force. "You make it sound so simple." "It rarely is," she agreed. "Particularly if someone buries the wrong seed." Pettigrew paused. "I wonder," Miss Marple said idly, "did you ever know Edmund Denning in London, before he came here?" Pettigrew shook his head too quickly. "No, I may have seen his name on a theatre flyer once, but we never moved in the same circles." She smiled, undeterred. "Interesting. I only ask because I found a scrap of writing tucked inside a glove, blue-black ink. Same as the notes you once gave the church for that poetry recital. Do you remember? You wrote a lovely sonnet about the butcher's dog." He paled. "I use blue ink because it's traditional. Lots of people do, indeed, still." There was something about the phrasing of the letter, very theatrical, rather like your poetry, and it mentioned Dover. His lips tightened. "That means nothing." "Oh, but it might. Dover's a very specific place. One doesn't mention it without reason." Pettigrew's hand trembled slightly as he dropped the shears into the basket. "If you're accusing me, I'm not accusing anyone," Miss Marple said, gentle as ever. "I'm only observing. It's rather what I do," as she made her way back down the lane toward Ivywell. She reflected on how people always underestimated the power of silence. Pettigrew's defensiveness had revealed far more than a confession might have. Back at the estate, Inspector Cray was waiting in the drawing-room like a cat who'd lost sight of the mouse. "Miss Marple," he said as she entered, "I believe you've been doing a little sleuthing of your own." "Oh no, Inspector, I wouldn't dream of interfering." Cray offered a tight smile. "I hear you've been asking about gloves and letters found. Anything you'd care to share?" She met his gaze pleasantly. "Well, I suppose I have come across a few odds and ends. The glove, for instance, belonged to a man, not a woman. Very finely made, though not local, and the letter inside it appears to be a threat, something to do with Dover." "Dover again," Cray muttered. "Yes, and then there's the matter of Philip Lacey." Cray looked up. "Lacey, the solicitor, what about him?" "He was seen speaking with Edmund shortly before the tableau, and he walks with a limp. Does he not?" Cray nodded slowly. "Yes, old injury. I imagine solicitors hear all sorts of family secrets, especially the kind that linger through generations. I do wonder whether he knew about the old will that Edmund was so fond of mentioning." Cray considered this. If Lacey was involved, he's covering it well. But then, most solicitors are trained in discretion. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "Quite so." She rose to leave, pausing by the mantel to examine a small-framed photograph of a younger Lady Alice, standing proudly between 2 men. One was clearly a younger version of Philip Lacey, The other, to Miss Marple's surprise, was unmistakably Dr. Hawthorne. They had all known each other far longer than any of them had said. She thanked the inspector and made her way through the house, but not before passing Mrs. Carlton Hedges in the hall. The vicar's wife looked distracted, clutching a small parcel and murmuring to herself, "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me such a fright. My apologies, my dear. Is something wrong?" "Noise? Well, not exactly. I was just bringing this to the church. It's something I meant to give to Elsie, but I've changed my mind." She glanced down at the parcel. "It's a necklace. One Edmund gave her. He told her it was vintage, from Paris. But I saw a similar one in the market at Bath last year, £10 at most. How disappointing." Mrs. Carlton Hedges sighed. "He was cruel, Jane. He knew how to wound people with flattery. He made Elsie believe she meant something, but he treated her affection like a performance, and did she ever confront him? She tried. The night before the fete, she came to the vicarage in tears. I offered to speak to him, but she said it would make things worse." It was the kind of afternoon that made one believe the world was essentially benign. The sun dappled the lawns of Ivywell Court through the soft veil of late summer clouds, and the shrill laughter of children mingled with the clink of teacups and the gentle whir of wasp. Villagers in their Sunday best strolled among hedgerows clipped with military precision, the scent of roses wafted from the trellises, and the heavy blooms hung like secrets waiting to be shaken loose. Lady Alice Brand, resplendent in a silk turban and carrying the weight of several committees, presided over the fete with the serene tyranny of one born to organize other people's enjoyment. Such a successful turnout. She announced to anyone within earshot, "We've raised nearly £40 for the hospital roof already." Miss Marple, sitting inconspicuously beneath a hollyhock in full flare, sipped her tea with mild amusement. She was not fond of garden fetesti tended to produce squabbles and sunburns, but her friend Mrs. Bantry had insisted. "Lady Alice would be crushed if you didn't come," she'd said. "And you know it's bound to be frightfully dull without it. Least one murder. That had been a joke. Of course, no one expected a real murder. The Masquerade tableau, a centrepiece of the event, was scheduled just after 4. It was a quaint tradition Lady Alice had revived from her youth, a display of costumes drawn from English history, with villagers posing in elaborate dress amidst carefully posed scenes. Lady Alice herself was Boadicea, standing triumphantly over a makeshift Roman soldier. Mrs. Carlton Hedges, the vicar's wife, portrayed Elizabeth I, her ruff somewhat crooked from too much lemon sponge. Then there was Edmund Denning, tall, theatrical, and far too fond of mirrors. Edmund had come down from London to recover his spirit. As he phrased it, no one quite knew what he did in London, but he dropped names like confetti and had once claimed to have dined beside Noel Coward. He was dressed today as the Scarlet Pimpernel, all-sweeping cloak and rakish grin, with a foil strapped to his hip and a gleam in his eye that made half the village wives giggle inappropriately. When the church bells struck 4, the crowd gathered for the tableau near the croquet lawn. The curtain sheet dyed red and pinned between 2 willow trees was drawn aside. Gasps and scattered applause erupted as the villagers beheld the scene. But something was wrong. The Scarlet Pimpernel did not rise with a witty flourish. He remained slumped against the stone bench, head tilted unnaturally, one hand trailing in the grass. It was Mrs. Bantry, of course, who screamed first. Edmund Denning was dead. The foil on his belt was missing. In its place was a short, sharp dagger and authentic prop. Someone muttered later that had pierced clean through the velvet of his costume and deep into his chest. Lady Alice turned pale beneath her rouge. The crowd rippled with confusion, horror, and a rising tide of speculation. Miss Marple set her teacup down quietly, as if she had expected something disagreeable to happen all Along, I do hope, she said softly to no one in particular, that this won't delay the tombola. The body was covered in a quilted picnic blanket, one of Mrs. Proudie's, who fainted when she realised it was hers. Constable Edgar Sims, flushed and flustered, stood awkwardly beside the scene with his notebook, pen poised but untouched. It was his first murder, and it sat uneasily on his shoulders like a borrowed coat. The village fete had promptly collapsed into chaos, teacups abandoned midship, bunting torn by hurried feet, and children corralled by shrill, trembling nannies. Lady Alice Brent was seated on a wicker chair fetched hastily from the parlour, one hand gripping her brooch like a lifeline. In all my years, she muttered to no one in particular, I've never seen anything quite so vulgar. On my lawn, no less. Poor Edmund, what an absolute scene. It was not long before the rumours began, creeping across the estate like a mist rolling off the downs. Within the hour, Ivywell Court had transformed from fete ground to a theatre of suspicion. Heart attack, surely, said Mr. Bellamy, the baker, whose medical knowledge consisted largely of self-diagnosed indigestion. Rubbish, snapped Miss Gold, the postmistress, peering over her spectacles. You don't get stabbed in the chest from a heart attack. It could have been an accident, offered Mrs. Carlton Hedges, who had emerged from her Elizabethan garb and now wore the expression of someone who regretted ever volunteering. Perhaps the blade was improperly secured, a tragic theatrical mishap, said Mr. Pettigrew, the Latin master from the village school. Quite in the spirit of the thing, isn't it? Miss Marple, unhurried and unruffled, took her usual slow stroll around the edge of the crowd. She listened, as she always did, not merely to the words, but to the tones, the hesitations, and the curious absences in speech. Grief, she'd often observed, made people silent. Guilt made them speak too much. She noticed young Elsie Denning, Edmund's cousin, standing near the old sundial, shoulders stiff and face pale. She clutched her handbag tightly, though there was no need to hold anything at all now. Next to her was Dr. Hawthorne, Ivywell's retired GP, who had been summoned before the police arrived. He had done his part quietly and professionally, confirming that Edmund was indeed dead before stepping back and lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. Unfortunate place for a wound. He'd muttered to no one in particular, very direct. Must have gone in clean between the ribs. Miss Marple made a mental note. Not because of the wound that was the sort of thing for professionals to sort, but because of the way he said it. The old doctor had always been a careful speaker. He knew more than he let on. And that struck her as curious. Mrs. Bantry emerged from the drawing-room, her usual cheer now replaced with pinched concern. She spotted Miss Marple near the trellis and joined her, clutching her shawl like a woman anticipating a storm. My dear, she whispered, eyes darting, it's simply dreadful, isn't it? One moment he's grinning like a pantomime villain and the next stabbed in front of the whole village. Have you ever? I mean, I know you have, but in a masquerade to blow, good heavens. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, very theatrical, too. Theatrical, perhaps. Do you think someone planned it? Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, planning is a curious thing. Dolly, it rarely announces itself, but you can always tell by the edges. Improvisation is messy, but this seemed rather neat. Don't you think? Mrs. Bantry shivered. Well, I hope the police know what they're doing. Though if they're relying on young Sims, heaven help us, he once fined Mr. Bellamy for parking his bicycle on the wrong side of the green. The investigation, if it could be called that yet, was in its earlier stumbles. Inspector Cray, summoned from Much Benham, was due to arrive by evening. In the meantime, Constable Sims did his best to keep the crowd from wandering too close to the crime scene. Though without great success, the villagers, their curiosity piqued beyond measure, hovered like crows near a ploughshare. In the parlour of Ivywell Court, a gathering of sorts formed less a formal inquiry, more the sort of cluster that always happens in times of confusion. Lady Alice sat stiffly beside the fireplace, flanked by Mrs. Carlton Hedges and the ever-observant Vicar Reverend Prowse. Mr. Pettigrew hovered by the sherry decanter, eyeing it with longing but propriety. Miss Gold, naturally, had inserted herself into the proceedings, not by invitation but by sheer force of will, so who had reason to dislike Edmund Denning? She asked loudly, folding her arms. He wasn't liked, you know. Said dreadful things about the fete in the Post Office last week. Called it provincial theatre at its worst. That's hardly a motive for murder, Miss Gold muttered to the vicar, polishing his spectacles. Well, perhaps not for everyone, she snapped, but it might be for someone with feelings. Mrs. Carlton Hedges, normally mild, turned with a sharp intake of breath. That's uncalled for, Ada. Feelings have nothing to do with this. Edmund may have been flamboyant, but he was no villain. But not a saint either, added Mr. Pettigrew dryly. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the room with a needlepoint frame resting on her lap, watched them all in turn. She found the reactions quite fascinating. Everyone had something to say, but no one asked the most pressing question: why here, why now? Back outside, the fete ground had become a memory. The marquee stood empty, flapping slightly in the breeze. A few flattened scones lay discarded on the grass, bunting hung at sad angles, and the tableau stand, where Edmund Denning had once posed so dramatically, now stood silent and bare. Miss Marple wandered there again later, when most of the crowd had dispersed. A few constables milled about, but no one challenged her. After all, she was just dear old Miss Marple, white-haired, unthreatening, and entirely invisible to those who ought to be more observant. She crouched slightly to study the grass where Edmund had fallen. A faint imprint remained. And something. Elsie, a small, curved object, half-buried in the lawn. She nudged it carefully with her gloved finger. A button, not from Edmund's costume, had silver toggles, but this was mother of pearl, modest, likely from a blouse or shirt. She picked it up and slipped it into her reticule without a word. Buttons, she murmured softly, so terribly prone to betrayal. As the sun began its slow descent beyond the hills, casting Ivywell Court in amber light, the villagers returned to their homes, doors closing like secrets, behind lace curtains and thick hedges. The gossip resumed in earnest. Miss Marple laid a hand gently on her arm. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can do is simply believe someone. Mrs. Carlton Hedges nodded, her eyes watery. I just hope none of this breaks her. She's not strong, Jane, not like you. Miss Marple smiled. People are often stronger than they know, especially when they must be. Later that evening, the vicar gave an informal sermon in the side chapel. Only a few villagers attended. Scattered across pews like fallen petals, Elsie sat near the back, pale and still. Miss Marple watched from the shadows. Unnoticed, she saw the way Philip Lacey avoided meeting Elsie's eyes. She saw the flicker of tension in Dr. Hawthorne's jaw as the vicar mentioned justice and forgiveness in the same breath, and she noticed Mr. Pettigrew slip quietly out before the final prayer. The mask was beginning to slip, but it had not yet fallen. As the last candle flickered and the villagers drifted into the night, Miss Marple stepped into the cool air and looked up at the stars, patterns everywhere, the sky, the people. The lies they told, the truth, she thought, was close now, but like a candle in a hall of mirrors, it would take care to find it without being fooled by reflections, and someone, she suspected, was already planning to strike again before the truth came to light. The morning after the vicar's quiet sermon broke with the startling clarity of birdsong and sunlight, as if nature herself had chosen to ignore the unease coiled in the hearts of St. Mary Mead's villagers. But beneath the blooming clematis and fresh laundry hung on lines, tension still lingered. It wrapped around the village like ivy on old stone, creeping, clinging, and hard to root out. Miss Marple, rising early as always, took her tea by the window, and watched the street with soft, thoughtful eyes. She had not slept much. The previous evening had brought more than just whispered confessions and glances exchanged in the chapel shadows. It had brought her something deeper, a shift. She sensed it. The way a gardener senses rain before the sky turns, something was about to break. It did not take long. By mid-morning, the quiet was shattered by a clatter of hooves and the distant cry of a constable on a bicycle. It wasn't often Constable Sims moved with such urgency. His arrival at Ivywell Court was witnessed by Mrs. Martingale, who told Mrs. Gold, who relayed the news to Reverend Prowse, who passed it along to Lady Alice by way of the florist's boy. There had been another incident, a break-in, not at the estate, but at the vicarage. Miss Marple was already lacing her shoes when the knock came at her door. "Miss Marple," Constable Sims said breathlessly, "I thought you might well. I thought perhaps you'd want to know firsthand." She fetched her hat and followed without a word. The vicarage garden was in disarray, rose petals scattered across the lawn, the back door slightly ajar. Inside, the Reverend stood with his spectacles askew and a look of helpless confusion. Mrs. Carlton Hedges hovered nearby, flustered but unharmed. "I just stepped out to gather some gooseberries," she explained, "only for a moment. When I returned, the study window was open, the drawer forced. I didn't touch anything." Cray was already there, crouched near the desk, examining the broken lock. Whoever it was knew what they were looking for, he said without looking up. Miss Marple stepped into the room and took in the scene. The vicar's study was a modest one, full of dust jackets and parish notices. A framed photo of his days at university hung slightly crooked on the wall. The drawer, now half open, revealed nothing but scattered stationery and a half-used stick of sealing wax. "Nothing missing," said Cray, "at least, not visibly." But Mrs. Carlton Hedges said the drawer once held a small wooden box. "Yes," she added, wringing her hands, "a gift box. It contained, well, it's rather personal, I suppose, letters, old ones." Cray looked up. Whose letters? Mrs. Carlton Hedges hesitated. Elsie's, letters she had sent to the Reverend for guidance, and one from Edmund. He had written something unkind, threatening, even. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the vicar. "And you kept those letters locked away?" "Yes," he replied, his voice weary. "Elsie begged me not to destroy them. She said she might need them one day, if things ever turned worse. I locked them away for her safety, but someone knew," said Miss Marple softly. "Someone knew they existed, and wanted them gone." Cray stood. "The question is who?" Miss Marple said nothing. She already had a list in her head, a short one, by midday. Word of the breaking had swept through the village like a sudden squall. It became the new focus of every whispered conversation. But gossip, while swift, often misleads. Miss Marple preferred quieter methods. She stopped by the market and, under the pretext of buying white currants, spoke with Miss Gold, who reported that Philip Lacey had left town abruptly that morning and called back to Much Benham for urgent legal matters, though no one believed that for a second. He had not said goodbye. "That one always struck me as slippery," Miss Gold said with relish. "And I know the look of a man running from something. Oh yes, he's hiding something. Mark my words." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Elsie Denning. The girl looked pale and drawn, seated beneath the lilac tree with a shawl over her shoulders despite the heat. "They said someone broke into the vicarage," she said without preamble. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "looking for your letters, it seems." Elsie's mouth tightened. "I suppose that means it wasn't a stranger after all." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "it rarely is. Elsie was silent for a long moment before whispering. "Do you think it was Philip?" Miss Marple studied her. "Why would he?" Elsie's hands twisted the edge of her shawl. "Because I asked him to help. When Edmund started threatening me, I told Philip. He was always kind. He promised to speak to Edmund. Not as a solicitor, as a friend, and did he?" "I think so." They argued. I didn't hear what was said, but Philip was angry when he left the drawing room. That was 2 days before the fete. Did he know about the letters? Elsie nodded. "I told him. I thought it might help if Edmund knew someone else had proof of what he'd said." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You did what you thought was right." But in her mind, the pieces began to shift again. Philip Lacey might have confronted Edmund. He might have known about the letters. But breaking into a vicarage, stealing documents, then fleeing town, those weren't the actions of a murderer trying to escape justice. Those were the acts of a man trying to clean up a mistake or to protect someone. As she returned home that evening, Miss Marple noticed a figure standing at the edge of her gate. Dr. Hawthorne, dressed in his usual brown suit, though the jacket hung more loosely now. He looked tired. "Jane," he said, voice low, "I must speak." "With you?" She nodded and ushered him inside. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the slow tick of the mantel clock. "I didn't kill Edmund," he said finally. "But I lied. I knew him in London. Years ago, we were entangled in a rather foolish investment, a private clinic. Edmund promised high returns. It failed. Naturally, I lost everything, my pension, my reputation." Miss Marple said nothing, waiting. "When he came to Ivywell and saw me again, he threatened to expose the entire affair, said he had letters, proof. I told him I'd pay him to stay quiet. But he wanted more than money," Miss Marple said quietly. Hawthorne looked up. "Yes, he wanted leverage. Over everyone, not just me. And now he's dead." The doctor nodded. "I thought about it, Jane. I truly did. But I couldn't, I swear it." She believed him, not because he said it with conviction, but because he said it with despair, as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead. The village drew inward once more. Lamps glowed behind curtains, doors locked with quiet finality. But in Miss Marple's study, a new name had joined her list, a name she had not considered before. Not Philip, not Elsie, not the doctor. Someone quieter, more patient, and possibly far more dangerous. The masquerade was almost over, but the final mask had yet to fall. It was the kind of evening that hovered delicately between seasons, warmth ebbing slowly as autumn's cool hand touched the air. The sun cast long shadows across Ivywell's lawn, and the village of St. Mary Mead seemed, at last, to exhale. After days of tension and whispered speculation, there was a stillness now. But for Miss Marple, it was not the calm of resolution. It was the quiet that comes just before the truth is revealed. She sat by her parlour window, knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the distant trees swaying against the golting sky. Inside, her little green ledger lay open on the side table. It was no longer just a page of notes and disconnected observations. It had begun to resemble something whole, a pattern. A picture slowly coming into focus. There was one piece left to place, and it was time to place it. Shortly after tea, she sent a note by hand to Mrs. Carlton Hedges. "My dear, would you be so kind as to join me for a quiet conversation this evening? Just the two of us. I believe we have much to discuss." Warmly, Jane Marple, it was received. Without hesitation, and precisely at 7:30, the vicar's wife appeared at the garden gate, modestly dressed in lavender wool, her expression one of cautious politeness. She carried a small handbag tucked tightly under one arm. "Jane," she said gently, "your note was unexpected. I hope not unwelcome," Miss Marple replied, ushering her inside. "Come in, dear, the evening is turning cool." Theories blossomed, then withered under scrutiny. only to be replaced by more elaborate tales. Miss Marple, seated once more in her modest parlour on Church Lane, placed the button beside her saucer and gazed out the window. She had seen it before. The look in Edmund Denning's eyes as he posed, the particular tightness in young Elsie's mouth, the tremor in Dr. Hawthorne's hand. Pieces, all of them, but not yet arranged. Murder, she thought, rarely arrives with thunder. It comes like an old acquaintance, invited or not, and this one, she knew, had been planning its entrance for quite some time. By the following morning, the air in St. Mary Mead had shifted. It no longer carried only the scent of honeysuckle and bread from the bakery ovens. It carried whispers, all through Church Lane, across the village green, and into the dark panelled shops of High Street. The talk was of Edmund Denning and the dagger lodged in his chest. Ivywell Court was now sealed off, its gravel drive guarded rather ineffectively by young Sims, who stood rigid as a birch post at the gates, a clipboard clutched in his damp hands. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Prowse conducted his usual morning prayers with a distracted air, offering up Edmund's soul with more confusion than conviction. At the grocer's, Mrs. Martinell miscounted 3 tins of anchovies while recounting the details of the masquerade scene to a grim-faced Mr. Finch, who only yesterday had claimed he'd left the fete early due to a headache. Today, it was indigestion. And in Miss Marple's neat little cottage, the parlour clock ticked steadily as she carefully unwrapped a small, folded handkerchief. Inside, nestled in a corner, was the mother-of-pearl button. She had polished it gently with a scrap of muslin and inspected it under her magnifying glass. A faint thread still clung to the back, a dusky blue, likely cotton, not from Edmund's theatrical garb, certainly, nor from the sort of clothing a gentleman might wear. She made a note of it in her little green ledger, not facts, necessarily. Impressions, observations. Miss Marple's gift had never been one of scientific deduction, but of recognizing the ever-repeating patterns in human nature. People, she always said, rarely surprised her. The methods changed. The motives did not. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had arrived at Ivywell Court, a tall, square-jawed man with a moustache like a paint-brush and an aversion to untidiness. He strode across the estate with a purposeful gait and a notebook that clicked crisply every time he turned a page. He was no fool. He had once solved the Much Winchcombe strangler case by correctly deducing the killer's handwriting in a forged will, but he had little patience for what he referred to as village theatrics. Plain case, he said to Constable Sims as they stood near the bloodless lawn where the body had been discovered. Too much show always makes things easier. Oddly enough, the killer wants to be seen. They crave drama. Sims blinked. So you think it was someone dramatic? Cray shot him a look. I think it was someone close, and someone who wasn't thinking they'd be caught. Too many moving parts otherwise. It was someone at the fete, someone who knew the scene, that narrows it down. Miss Marple, seated beside a freshly trimmed lavender bush, overheard every word. Cray had not noticed her yet. Few did. That was her greatest advantage. Later, as the inspector began interviews in the drawing-room of Ivywell, Miss Marple received a visit. It was Elsie Denning. The girl looked exhausted, dark shadows beneath her eyes, her hands trembling as she accepted a cup of tea. She was dressed in mourning already, though it seemed too soon for such conventions. Her simple black cardigan over a navy skirt, hair pinned in a practical twist. She looked, Miss Marple thought, as though she were trying to disappear. I didn't know where else to go, Elsie said softly, her voice stretched thin. They're asking so many questions at the house. I can't think straight. Well, tea first, Miss Marple said gently. Thinking is always best done with a cup in hand. Elsie nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. You and Edmund were cousins, weren't you? Miss Marple asked. Though she knew it perfectly well, yes, but We were raised more like brother and sister. After my parents died, I moved to London with Aunt Rosalind. Edmund's mother, Miss Marple, waited. People always told her more than they intended. She knew how to listen. I hadn't seen him much since I came back here, Elsie continued. He stayed in London. He always said he was too clever for the provinces. That's what he called it. But then, this spring, he said he needed a break. Something had happened. He never said what. A disappointment. I don't know, perhaps. Her voice dropped. He was very secretive lately. Something about a deal. Gone wrong, or a woman. Maybe both. But he wouldn't say. Miss Marple sipped her tea. He arrived at Ivywell just 2 weeks ago, didn't he? Yes, Lady Alice let him stay in the East Wing. He said he was writing something about a play, I think, but he spent most of his time walking around the estate and making the staff miserable. And you? Elsie looked up, startled. What about me? Were you miserable too? She hesitated. No. I mean, not exactly. He could be difficult. He liked to needle people, make them feel small. But that was his way. I didn't take it to heart. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Many people say that about those they fear. Elsie flushed and looked away. When she had gone, Miss Marple sat very still for some time, fingers curled around her teacup. Elsie had spoken carefully, but not truthfully. There was something she wasn't saying, something that hovered just behind her eyes. Not guilt, exactly. But fear, certainly. Not of what had happened. Of what might come next, by late afternoon. The inspector had compiled a neat list of interviewees, most of whom had been corralled into the Ivywell library and were being called in one by one. Among them were Lady Alice herself, who had offered up only shock and outrage Mrs. Carlton Hedges, who trembled so violently that her hat fell off and Mr. Pettigrew, who had to be reminded 3 times to stop quoting Hamlet and answer the actual questions. Dr. Hawthorne, however, proved less forthcoming. I saw him just before the tableau, he said. He seemed in good spirits, arrogant, of course, but that was nothing new. Did he mention anyone he was expecting to meet? Cray asked. No. Though I did see him speaking privately with Miss Denning the day before, quite an intense conversation. And did you overhear it? I make it a point not to eavesdrop, the doctor replied. But I recall she looked rather upset. Cray made a note, then dismissed him. Out in the garden, Miss Marple ran her hand along the wooden edge of the stage. The curtain had been taken down. The daïs was bare now, save for a few scuffed petals, and a paper programme trampled into the grass. She bent to retrieve it. The cast list was typed neatly, with roles beside each name. Edmund Denning was listed as the Scarlet Pimpernel. Beside it, in pencil, someone had scrawled, or just a villain in disguise. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her handbag. A moment later, she spotted young Sims striding toward her with an apologetic look. Sorry, Miss Marple, he said. Inspector's orders. No one's to linger here unless interviewed. Of course, she said with a smile. I was just admiring the workmanship. She walked away slowly, humming to herself as the wind picked up across the lawn. That night, the village slept uneasily. Windows were locked that usually stood open. Dogs barked at nothing, and in her parlour, lit only by the reading lamp, Miss Marple placed the programme beside the button and closed her ledger. There were too many performances in this village. The masquerade had ended, yes, but the masks had not yet come off. The sun rose dull and reluctant the next morning, shrouded in a pale haze that seemed to echo the mood of the village, the usual hum of St. Mary mead milk bottles clinking, hens fussing, voices drifting across gardens were subdued, as if the village itself were holding its breath. At Ivywell Court, Inspector Cray sat at the head of a long oak table, the scent of polish and dust thick in the air. Beside him, Constable Sims clutched a fresh sheaf of notes, his pen ready. Though his mind was a touch overwhelmed, they were Reviewing the growing web of statements, each more tangled than the last, Cray was beginning to sense what Miss Marple had already observed. No one was being entirely honest. So far, Cray said, tapping his pen against his notebook, our strongest lead is motive, and we have several. He flipped a page. Elsie Denningerson, perhaps rival. She was close to Edmund but reportedly had a falling out 2 days before the fete. A servant overheard raised voices, something about money or possibly letters. Sims nodded gravely, though the details had already escaped him. Then there's Dr. Hawthorne. Long-time friend of the family, but there's a rumour confirmed Edmund had threatened to expose something from the doctor's past. No idea what. Cray tapped again. And let's not forget Lady Alice herself. She wasn't particularly fond of Edmund either. There's talk he had a financial claim on the estate, some debt or inheritance tied up in old family arrangements. He sighed. It's a circus. They settled in the drawing-room with a pot of chamomile tea between them, steam curling softly into the air. For a while, they said nothing of significance, just pleasant remarks about weather, church flowers, and Mrs. Bantry's unfortunate pruning technique. Then Miss Marple poured a second cup and placed it before her guest with exquisite care. "You've been very kind to Elsie," she said. "I believe she would have fallen to pieces without you." Mrs. Carlton Hedges gave a small nod. "She's dear too. Me, like a daughter, really. She needed someone who understood her. And you do understand her," Miss Marple said, her tone light but deliberate. "Which is why I think it must be very hard to know what she nearly did. To know what Edmund made her feel." The cup in Mrs. Carlton Hedges' hand trembled slightly. She set it down. "You think she killed him?" she asked, not angrily, but with a strange calm. "No." Miss Marple said softly, "I don't." The silence between them lengthened, became something solid. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "I began with a button, just a plain mother-of-pearl button. Then came a glove, a letter, a peculiar ink, and whispers about Dover. I thought I was chasing Edmund's enemies. But it was the nature of the murder that told me everything." Mrs. Carlton Hedges' lips parted. "What do you mean?" "A knife thrust straight to the heart," Miss Marple said, "clean, certain. Not the act of someone panicked or enraged. Not a struggle, but deliberate, precise, and above all, unhesitating." Mrs. Carlton Hedges looked away. "I've lived a long time," Miss Marple went on, "and I've learned that rage does not always produce neatness, but there's a certain kind of determination that does, a tidy, private sort of resolve." "You're accusing me," the vicar's wife said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am asking you to tell the truth," Miss Marple replied, "because I believe you did it not for revenge but for love." For a long moment, Mrs. Carlton Hedges was still. Then she exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to release years. "I watched him ruin people," she said, quietly, cruelly, and always with a smile. "He toyed with Elsie, threatened her. Threatened Dr. Hawthorne, Philip, others. He didn't just manipulate, he enjoyed it. He liked knowing he could wound without consequence." And then she closed her eyes. "That evening before the fete, I saw him take something from the vicarage. I followed him to the shed. I asked him to stop. He laughed in my face, called me old and useless, said no one would ever believe me over him." Her hands gripped the teacup again. He turned away. "I saw the dagger from the display, still propped up on the bench. It was meant to be theatrical, a prop, but it was sharp, and it was there, and Miss Marple laid a hand gently over hers. "You were protecting her. She was going to take her own life," Mrs. Carlton Hedges said, her voice breaking. "I saw it in her eyes. I couldn't let him destroy her like that. Not another life." "Not again, Miss Marple echoed. The vicar's wife closed her eyes. "There was another girl, in Dover. Years ago, he destroyed her. She came to me for help, but I didn't do anything. I told myself it wasn't my place, and she didn't survive it. This time I couldn't stand by. Miss Marple said nothing for a long time. Then she rose, crossed to her bookshelf, and retrieved a small envelope. I found this in the garden shed. I believe it's the torn half of the letter Edmund had in his possession. You recognize the writing, I assume? Yes, she said quietly. It was the girl's. The one from Dover, Miss Marple nodded. Will you turn? Yourself in, she asked gently. I'm not afraid of prison, said Mrs. Carlton-Hedges, her back straight. I've been carrying this for years. I only regret that I waited so long to stop him. Miss Marple walked her to the door. As she stepped into the evening light, the vicar's wife paused. Thank you, Jane, she said. For seeing what others didn't, Miss Marple watched her go, her silhouette shrinking down the lane. Later that night, she rang Inspector Cray. I believe I may have something for you, she said. Best come in person. It concerns the murder. And I think it will put your questions to rest. When Cray arrived, bleary-eyed and unsmiling, she handed him the letter and quietly relayed what had passed between herself and the vicar's wife. He said nothing until she had finished. Well, he muttered finally, I suppose I should be grateful. You did half my job for me. Miss Marple smiled. Not at all. I only do what any woman of my age might take note of what others miss. And you're sure she's telling the truth? Yes, Miss Marple said. She's been telling it in silence for years. Cray left reluctantly, already rehearsing the difficult conversation he would have with the vicar come morning. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, the night still and full of stars. The masquerade was over. The masks had fallen, but there was no triumph in her heart. Only a quiet sorrow, because no murder, however justified by circumstance or cloaked in righteousness, ever left a village quite the same, and though Mrs. Carlton-Hedges had acted out of love, it had cost her everything. The masquerade at Ivywell had ended in truth, and truth, Miss Marple knew, was always the final guest to arrive. The next morning, a dampness hung in the air as though the village itself were exhaling. Rain had swept lightly through the night, softening the ground, and laying down a hush over St. Mary Mead. Ivywell Court, with its stately windows and clipped hedges, seemed subdued under the grey light, stripped of the festival glamour it had worn just days ago. The masquerade was truly over now, and in the stillness that followed, the truth waited like the last page of a book ready to be turned. Inspector Cray arrived at the vicarage shortly after breakfast. His boots tracked mud on the flagstone path as he approached the doorway with the weight of duty etched on his face. He had slept little, spent most of the night reading and rereading the torn letter Miss Marple had handed him, comparing handwriting, checking statements, and staring at a timeline that had become, at last, devastatingly clear. The Reverend Prowse met him at the door, his expression drawn and pale. She told me this morning, he said softly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. She confessed everything. I had no idea. Not even the faintest inkling. She meant to protect. You too, Cray said, stepping past him, and the girl. He found Mrs. Carlton-Hedges waiting in the parlour. She sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing the same lavender wool she had donned the evening before at Miss Marple's. Her face was calm, not defeated, resigned. I assume you've come to arrest me, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am, Cray replied, pulling out a folded sheet of paper from his coat on suspicion of the murder of Edmund Denning. She gave a single nod. I won't resist. The Reverend remained silent as his wife was led away. No sobbing, no dramatic protest. Only the long, slow sound of the door shutting behind her. Word of the arrest spread with the speed and delicacy of wildfire. By midday, the whole of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with theories. Indignation and, for some, satisfaction. Imagine, gasped Mrs. Martinelle at the grocer's, the vicar's own wife, she always did have a quiet look about her, murmured Miss Gold, peering over her spectacles. Still waters, you know. But why would she do such a thing? Asked Mr. Bellamy. She seemed so fond of the girl, always baking for the church, singing in the choir Miss Marple. Who stood at the back of the queue with a basket over her arm said, "Nothing." She simply gave a polite nod, paid for her sugar, and stepped out into the lane. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray visited her cottage. He arrived without preamble, his face still bearing that tight expression that suggested admiration, unwillingly earned. She made a full confession, he said as she poured tea, said she acted out of desperation, that she couldn't bear to see another girl destroyed by Denning's manipulations. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Passing him the milk, she told me as much. Cray stared into his cup. It was clean, clinical, even. She knew where to strike. She did. She was trained as a nurse before she married. You know, during the war. He blinks. I didn't. Few do. She doesn't speak of it. But she saw things, did things, helped wounded men survive, and sometimes watched them slip away when no help could save them. It stays with a woman, that kind of knowledge. Not just the technical part, but the moral part, too. Cray rubbed his jaw. So you knew, all along. Miss Marple gave her faintest smile. I suspected. But one never claims to know until the person tells you. It's not just a matter of deduction, it's a matter of readiness. People must be ready to speak, or to be heard. He looked at her, brow furrowing. Why didn't she run? She had time. Hours before the body was found, because she believed she had done the right thing, and people who believe they've acted out of love don't run from it. They only run when they're ashamed. She wasn't ashamed. Cray nodded slowly. And what about the others? He asked after a moment. Lacey, Pettigrew, Hawthorne, all of them had secrets tied to Denning. They did, Miss Marple said. And he exploited every one of them, but there's a difference between motive and action. He was pulling strings across Ivywell, blackmailing Dr. Hawthorne over a failed investment, threatening to reveal Mr. Pettigrew's rather improper letters, pressing Philip Lacey for a piece of the estate through an old inheritance loophole. He certainly collected enemies, yes, but none of them acted. They were compromised, embarrassed, even angry, but they didn't act. It was Mrs. Carlton Hedges who saw that the consequences would not end with shame or money. And not a single clear motive strong enough to push someone to murder. Not yet. At that very moment, Miss Marple was paying a call on Mrs. Maud Proudy, whose embroidery club had been cancelled in the wake of the murder, leaving her in a state of unspent opinion. My dear Jane, she said, ushering Miss Marple inside with fluttering hands, you can't imagine the things I've heard. And I always say, when people talk this much, half of it must be true. Miss Marple smiled serenely. Then, we must decide which half, mustn't we? They sat by the window, overlooking a patch of roses wilted slightly from yesterday's storm. Mrs. Proudy poured tea as she talked. I always said Edmund was the sort who'd come to a sticky end. Far too handsome, and not in a trustworthy way. And so smug, flaunting around the village like a matinee idol. I dare say it was only a matter of time. Did he have any particular friends while he was here? Friends? No, admirers, perhaps. That young Miss Farnham was quite taken with him always, giggling behind her hand. And Elsie, of course, though things soured, didn't they? Such a shame. She's a sweet girl, really. Shy. Did you notice anything strange on the day of the fete? Miss Marple asked, stirring her tea gently. Oh, heavens, where to begin? Mrs. Proudy leaned in. I saw Edmund arguing with someone just behind the marquee, only moments before the tableau began. I couldn't see clearly, it was obscured by the side of the tent, but I'm certain the other person had a limp. Miss Marple's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. A limp, yes, a slight one. The left foot dragging just a touch. It made the gravel crunch in a very particular way. I remember thinking it odd, and then the curtain went up and well. That detail nestled itself into Miss Marple's memory like a puzzle piece finally meeting its neighbour back at Ivywell. Inspector Cray was interviewing Lady Alice Brent, who had agreed somewhat huffily to speak again. I do hope this won't take long. Inspector, I have the Women's Guild tomorrow, and they expect sandwiches. I'll be as brief as possible, Lady Brent. Cray said, you are Edmund Denning's second cousin. Is that correct? Third. Technically, our grandfathers were brothers, not that it matters. And he was staying here at Ivywell as your guest, wellies. Though it was more at the insistence of his mother, Rosalind. She and I were at school together. Edmund had outstayed his welcome in London, I believe. Did he speak of any conflicts, disagreements while he was here? Lady Alice stiffened. Only in the general way. He was very, what's the word, opinionated. Though we were all bumpkins playing in society, called Ivywell a mausoleum of forgotten expectations. Can you imagine? Cray smiled politely. Were you aware of any financial disagreements? Lady Alice's cup rattled slightly as she set it down. I'm not sure what you mean. I understand there may have been some sort of unresolved debt tied to the estate. She pressed her lips together. That was a family matter, and not a criminal. Edmund always exaggerated. If he thought he could pressure me for a cheque, he was mistaken. Cray made a final note, thanked her, and exited the room, outside on the terrace. Miss Marple arrived just as Dr. Hawthorne was lighting a cigarette. He glanced up, unsurprised. Jane, he said, nodding, you've come to poke round too, have you? Oh, no poking, she replied. Just a little walking, and perhaps a question. He exhaled a plume of smoke. Watching it drift. Go on then. Do you recall? A guest at the fete who walked with a slight limp, left side, I believe. Hawthorne frowned. Now you mention it. Yes, Philip Lacey, a solicitor from Much Benham. He's Lady Alice's cousin. Or perhaps her solicitor. He broke his ankle last year, I think. Did he speak to Edmund? Briefly, near the refreshment tent. But then everyone spoke to Edmund. He made a point of it. Miss Marple thanked him and wandered on, her steps light but deliberate. As she passed a copse near the croquet lawn, she bent to retrieve a dropped glove brown leather, men's. Tucked inside was a small, folded square of parchment. It appeared to be a torn corner of a letter. Only one sentence was visible, and if you breathe a word, I'll ruin you publicly. She tucked it carefully away and glanced up as Inspector Cray approached, his expression grim. We're narrowing it down, he said without preamble. The cousin, the doctor, the girl, maybe all three. Still too many threads. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But threads have a habit of tangling, Inspector, until the right hand pulls gently on the right one. Cray frowned. And have you found that hand? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not quite, but I've seen hands like it before. As the evening came on, the village seemed no closer to peace. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains. The hedgerows whispered with the wind, and in Miss Marple's drawing room, the pieces of the puzzle were gently sliding into place, not in the shape of a solution, not yet, but into a clearer question. Who among them wore the mask best? It was the sort of morning that made one believe summer might linger, forelight dappling the garden path, bees drowsing in the foxgloves, and the world momentarily forgetting that murder had happened just days before. But in St. Mary Mead, forgetting was never so simple. It was a village with long memories and short patience, and the talk still wound its way through parlours and post offices with relentless curiosity. Miss Marple, however, was not talking. She was watching, from her seat beneath the sitting-room window. She stitched slowly, eyes occasionally drifting to the huffled page in her green ledger. She had written just 3 words that morning. button, letter, glove, not facts, not yet. But together they told her something important. Someone had not only prepared to commit the murder, but had also taken care to remove or destroy something afterward and had failed. She rose quietly and stepped out into her little garden, greeting Mr. Jeffers the postman with a smile as he passed. "Good morning, Miss Marple. A quiet day ahead, I hope, oh." "One never hopes for too quiet a day," she replied. "They tend to end with shocks when you're least prepared." Mr. Jeffers laughed and tipped his cap, none the wiser. By noon she was seated in the back pew of St. Mildred's Church, listening not to the Reverend's soft organ practice, but to the hollow sound of her own thoughts. Churches had always soothed her. Not for their theology, though she appreciated a good sermon, but because they were often the only places where people revealed their true selves, even if by accident. And sure enough, she was not alone. Near the side chapel, half obscured by a pillar, sat young Elsie Denning, hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed on the worn velvet kneeler before her. Her expression was unreadable, but Miss Marple knew grief when she saw it. This, however, looked more like dread. She did not interrupt the girl. Instead, she left a note with the verger, asking Elsie to call on her later, if she felt so inclined. Then she made her way back to Ivywell Court. Inspector Cray was in the midst of a second round of questioning, though his patience was showing signs of wear. Constable Sims trailed behind him like a child shadowing his schoolmaster, eager but uncertain. "You again, Miss Marple," Cray said as she stepped lightly into the parlour. "I do seem to find myself here quite a lot, don't I? But then the roses are very fine in the East Garden. I wondered if I might take a clipping." Cray raised an eyebrow. "Are you hoping to overhear something while you're pruning, or just fond of gardening?" "Both, I suppose," she said pleasantly, "though I have always found that roses, like people, grow best when carefully observed." He sighed. "As long as you stay out of the way." She gave a prime nod and wandered out onto the terrace, where the doors stood open to let in the breeze. They would end with tragedy, and she acted, not out of vengeance, but to stop a cycle she had once allowed to continue. Cray sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "She'll be tried," he said finally, "and likely imprisoned." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her voice quiet. "But justice takes many forms, Inspector, and punishment does not always cure the soul." Outside the window, children's laughter floated from the lane. The sun had broken through the morning's gloom, casting dappled gold across the path and the hedge. Life, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, carried on. But that evening, as twilight gathered, a few villagers gathered quietly on the green. Mrs. Bantry laid flowers at the edge of the stage where the tableau had once stood. Reverend Prowse offered a prayer, short and tender. There were no speeches, no tributes to the fallen, only silence. Elsie Denning, dressed in mourning, stood beside the lilac tree where she had once read poetry aloud to Edmund Denning in happier times. She said nothing, only placed a hand gently over her heart and let it fall again. Miss Marple watched from the lane. She made no move to join them. Her role was not to share in their mourning, but to witness it, to remember, as night settled in. She returned to her cottage and turned down the lamp. The green ledger still lay on her side table. She opened it and added one last line: "Motives deceive, character reveals." She closed the book gently, set it beside her teacup, and looked out into the stars. The village would sleep tonight, and tomorrow it would wake again. It would speak of other things. Baking contests, church banners, someone's cousin from Sussex. The masquerade was over, but the lessons of the performance would linger in quiet hearts. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever kind, would continue her gentle observations, because she knew, better than anyone, that in the quietest places the loudest truths are whispered. The days following Mrs. Carlton Hedges' arrest was marked by a strange quiet in St. Mary Mead. It was not the tense, fearful silence that had followed Edmund Denning's murder, nor the buzzing curiosity that had surged in its immediate wake. No. This was a gentler quiet one of contemplation, as if the village, with all its tidy gardens and lace-curtained windows, had taken a collective breath and decided to exhale slowly. Life, after all, does not pause for tragedy. Not even the sort that tears at the moral fabric of a place like Ivywell Court. At the vicarage, Reverend Prowse resumed his duties with a subdued solemnity. He delivered sermons with more softness now, less fire and brimstone, and more tenderness in his phrasing. When he spoke of forgiveness, there was a weight behind the words that hadn't been there before. Some parishioners said his sermons had improved. Others said they made them feel uncomfortable. No one said much at all about Mrs. Carlton Hedges. The Women's Guild met again the following Thursday. There were fewer biscuits and fewer opinions about bunting, but the meeting went on. Lady Alice, who had initially resisted returning to her hosting duties, resumed them with a mixture of stiff resolve and buried unease. She wore her pearls tighter, her turban slightly more askew, and spoke often of a new season of healing. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her usual routines with an almost imperceptible shift in step. Her garden, which had suffered some neglect during the excitement, was now back in order. The roses were trimmed, the ivy trained, her little green ledger had been closed and returned to its drawer, but even though it was closed, it was not forgotten. One morning, just a week after the funeral service for the Edmund Denningman affair, sparsely attended and met with ambivalence, Miss Marple received a visitor. It was Elsie Denning. The young woman stood at the gate, dressed plainly in navy, her hands clasped before her. She looked thinner than before, though not from vanity or fashion. It was the sort of thinness that grief leaves behind. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, ushering her inside. They sat in the parlour with the windows open to let in the breeze. A blackbird sang from the hedge. The teacups clinked once, then settled. "I wanted to thank you," Elsie said at last, "for the tea, for everything, for listening, for believing me, for protecting me, in your way." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I did very little. You were the one who had to endure the hardest part. I don't know what happens next," Elsie said softly. "I've been offered work in Bath, a small school, nothing grand. It sounds ideal," Miss Marple said. "I thought I might stay here longer, but everything feels different now, like I no longer belong in this village." Miss Marple considered that. "Belonging," she said after a moment, "is not a matter of place, my dear. It's a matter of peace. If you find peace in Bath, then that is where you belong. St. Mary Mead will always be here should you need it again. We are rather stubborn about remaining where we are." Elsie smiled faintly. "May I ask something, Miss Marple?" "Anything. What do you think she did, Miss Carlton Hedge was wrong?" Miss Marple was silent for a long time. "I think it was human," she said finally, "which is to say, it was both wrong and understandable. She acted out of love and regret and fear. That doesn't absolve her, but it does explain her. I keep wondering if she hadn't done it, would I have?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "I don't believe so." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've watched you. You have a quiet strength, Elsie. You endure, you survive. And people like you do not take life. They protect it, even when no one else sees." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and comforting all at once, when Elsie left. Miss Marple watched her go with the peculiar mix of pride and melancholy that only the very old can truly understand. She had seen many come and go, many learn, many fall, but it never got easier, sending them out into the world. Later that day, she took a walk through Ivywell's gardens. They were once again open to the public, though the Masquerade platform had been quietly dismantled and the costumes packed away. No one wanted reminders of that day, yet no one dared discard them either. The village had a curious relationship with its tragedies. They were folded neatly and placed on the highest shelf, too painful to display, too significant to throw away. At the edge of the croquet lawn, she found Dr. Hawthorne seated on a bench, staring into nothing. She was brave, he said when she approached. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. She always was. Will she go to prison? For a time, likely, but I believe her testimony and her motive will soften the judgment. The judge will see what we all did, the doctor gave a slow nod. I should have done more, years ago. I knew Edmund was dangerous, I just let him frighten me. So did we all, Miss Marple said. No, not you, she smiled. I even know what it is to be afraid. But fear does not last, Dr. Hawthorne. Not when we let the truth in. It's a bit like opening the windows after a storm. They sat in silence for a while, the breeze brushing the grass in gentle strokes. The next morning, the village resumed its normal rhythm. The bakery reopened on Tuesdays. The church bells rang a familiar tune. Someone's cat was caught in the vestry rafters again, and the school children, oblivious to the gravity of adult affairs, resumed their games by the green, shouting and laughing as if the world had never trembled. Miss Marple sat quietly by her front garden with her knitting in hand and her eyes watchful. A few weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was neat, steady. Dear Miss Marple, I have arrived safely in Bath. The school is charming. The girls remind me of myself when I was young. Clever, unsure of their place. I hope I can help them find it. I have joined a poetry group. We meet by the river on Thursdays. It's a little odd, but I think I like it. I often think of you. With gratitude, Elsie. Miss Marple folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beside her ledger, and smiled. The masquerade at Ivywell Court had ended with tears, with truths, with the slow stitching together of broken lives, but as with all things in St. Mary Mead, life had found its rhythm again, not untouched, but not undone either, and Miss Marple, steady as ever, would be there for the next mystery, the next quiet sorrow, the next unspoken truth waiting for someone to listen.